More than a few times over the years, we've had to sit through poorly designed boss fights in games that are otherwise excellent, and we've spoken often about such boss fights here on GamingBolt as well. Every so often, however, the opposite can also happen, where we end up enjoying boss fights to a surprising degree, in spite of the fact that the games that they are in are, for the most part, and for one reason or the other, largely underwhelming. Here, we're going to talk about a few such boss fights. ETERNATUS, Pokemon Sword and Shield. Pokemon Sword and Shield have a lot of shortcomings that have rightly gotten them criticism, but when the time finally came for the games to pull their campaign to an end, they didn't hold any punches. In probably the most memorable sequence in the games, you end up taking on Eternatus, an eldritch abomination that threatens the world in an epic 3-part battle, including a coda where you, your rival, and the legendary mascots of the game all take him down together in a 4 vs 1 raid. It's really a great spectacle, it's mechanically fun, the music is excellent, and elevates the whole thing to another level. HAOS, Resident Evil 6. Boss fights are the one thing that Resident Evil as a series has always excelled at, no matter the ups and downs, to the extent that even Resident Evil 6, the lowest of the series' lows, has a few decent boss fights here and there. Chris and Pia's campaign, for instance, is characterized by some of that game's worst and most mindless action-heavy sequences, but even so, it at least manages to end strong. The HAOS boss fight is solid on multiple levels, from being a visual spectacle to being mechanically engaging. No, it's not even close to being among the series' best bosses, but it's definitely one of the game's high points. NEMESIS, Resident Evil 3 2020.
Rocket launcher? Really?
By no means is anyone suggesting here that 2020's Resident Evil 3 is even close to being on the same level as RE6. The former, unlike the latter, is at the very least a decent game, and depending on who you ask, even a good one. Either way, it is a disappointing game in many ways, especially coming off the back of the excellent Resident Evil 2 remake. How it handles Nemesis as a stalker enemy is one of its biggest issues. But at the same time, when it comes to boss fights, Nemesis is one of the game's highlights. Pretty much every single Nemesis boss fight in the game is a blast, from the one on the rooftop to the one outside the clock tower to, of course, the final fight in the lab. DEMISE, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Widespread reception for The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword has certainly softened a bit in the last few years, especially following the launch of its Switch remaster, but ultimately, it's hard to deny that this was a real low point for the series. Even so, there were some areas where even its biggest detractors will admit that Skyward Sword had many things going for it. Boss fights in particular were solid throughout the game, so it makes sense that the very final fight was similarly solid. The encounter against DEMISE succeeds not only as a cinematic conclusion to the game, but also on narrative and gameplay fronts, especially in terms of its implications for the games that succeed Skyward Sword in Zelda's chronology. HOOF, BIOMUTANT. BIOMUTANT was in the works for quite some time, and from its premise to the talent that was working on it, there were many reasons why people had kept their eyes on it throughout the course of that development. When it launched last year, it was far from being good enough to live up to years of anticipation, though it wasn't without its redeeming qualities. The boss fight against HOOF, for instance, was one of those moments where the game's strengths came together to deliver a solid sequence, an interesting visual design for the boss, the right level of challenge, and a well-designed fight that put your skills to the test in an interesting way. MECHA Smith, The Matrix Path of Neo. The Matrix Path of Neo has its fair share of fans, sure enough, but by and large, it's hard to argue that it's anything more than a decent yet incredibly rough adaptation of a popular license. It's when the game goes truly off rails and does its own thing when it shines the brightest though, and the final boss fight against a MECHA Smith is one of those moments. It's completely bizarre and ridiculously over the top, and the game revels in that, turning it into a memorable fourth wall-breaking moment. The actual fight itself isn't special by any means, but everything surrounding it is so unique that you can't help but enjoy it. EOS Architect, Mass Effect Andromeda. Mass Effect as a series has had something of a spotty track record with boss fights, and Andromeda, its most inconsistent entry, very much continues that tradition. There aren't a lot of bosses in the game's main story that players think back on fondly, but if you decide to go off the beaten path, you'll find one or two memorable encounters. The EOS Architect is one of them, a massive monstrosity that instantly impresses with its visual design, and actually manages to do justice to its foreboding design when it comes to the actual mechanics and challenge of the fight. MODOK, Marvel's Avengers. That Marvel's Avengers isn't brimming with excellent boss fights against a variety of iconic Marvel baddies is one of many examples of how the game wasted the immense potential of its license. But even so, the few boss battles that are there in the game show glimpses of what could have been. The final fight against MODOK is one of the game's highlights without a doubt. It's a long, multi-phased affair that presents a decent level of challenge, and at the same time also feels like an actual high-stakes affair with actual potential consequences. Visually too, the fight is a solid one, and feels like the sort of big, epic conclusion you'd expect from a superhero story. HECHATONCHEIRIES, God of War Ascension. One of Ascension's biggest issues was that it stuck too closely to the old formula and was a little too afraid of doing anything new and exciting. Even so, that actually turned out to be one of its biggest strengths when it came to boss fights, because old boss fights were without equal. The opening encounter against the HECHATONCHEIRIES is vintage God of War. Kratos goes up against a massive foe that's so much larger and more powerful than him on paper, it actually boggles the mind. Watching him overcome that challenge throughout the encounter in typically brutal and epic fashion is exactly as satisfying as you'd expect from classic God of War. Atom Smasher, Cyberpunk 2077. To say that Cyberpunk 2077 failed to make good on many of its lofty promises would be a massive understatement, but even so, there were times when the game's buried strengths would come together to deliver moments where it showed its potential. That happens in the game's final moments as well. The Atom Smasher boss fight is easily one of the best sequences in Cyberpunk 2077 from a gameplay perspective. It's legitimately challenging and demands that you use your abilities and skills in a way that pretty much nothing else in the game does. And that brings us to the end of the video. A quick request before we conclude though. We upload new videos every single day, and if you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing. It really helps us out. Also, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon so that you can receive daily video updates. Thanks for watching.